Her lips were sealed in a motionless mask of pale flesh. Yet, from deep inside her chest, I heard it. My name. Whispered in my mother's voice. In this town, silence doesn't just speak, it vibrates in your bones. And once you hear the rhythm, your own body starts to sing along. Silas Vance stepped off the rusted bus and into the suffocating embrace of Blackwood Bay on the 13th of November. The fog had rolled in early that afternoon, settling over the coastal town until it felt as thick and tactile as matted, wet wool against his face. High above, the sky hung like a leaden weight, pressing down on the jagged rooftops and narrow alleys until the entire world seemed to shrink into a claustrophobic gray box. The air carried a sharp, stinging scent of iodine mingled with the more cloying stench of rotting driftwood and the ancient salt that had bitten deep into every brick and timber over the decades. It was a place where time appeared to have curdled, leaving behind a residue of dampness that clung to Silas's lungs with every shallow breath. Beyond the line of visibility, the Atlantic Ocean asserted its presence with a rhythmic, unrelenting violence that served as the town's only heartbeat. Each wave struck the obsidian black rocks with a dull, hollow thud, a sound that resonated in the marrow of Silas's bones rather than in his ears. It was a heavy, sick cadence, echoing the laboring thumps of a giant, diseased heart struggling beneath the surface of the tide. The spray from these collisions drifted upward in a fine, freezing mist, coating his eyelashes in a layer of brine that tasted of copper and forgotten depths. He stood for a moment, listening to the vast, watery engine of the bay, feeling more like an intruder than a visitor in this desolate sanctuary of stone and spray. Silas began to move along the crumbling promenade, his boots echoing with a lonely, wet slap against the salt-slicked pavement. To his left, the skeletal remains of abandoned shipyards loomed out of the mist, their empty window sockets staring at him like the eyes of drowned men. The wind, sharp and erratic, found its way into the rusted gaps of the corrugated metal walls, producing a series of mournful shrieks and low, guttural moans. It was a hollow, metallic whistling that seemed to follow him, a choir of ghosts singing of lost cargo and sunken hulls. He pulled his heavy wool coat tighter around his frame, but the dampness had already bypassed the fabric, settling into his skin like a second, colder layer of clothing. As he reached the corner of the central square, a flickering, yellowed light fought a losing battle against the encroaching gray of the November evening. The source was a single, swaying street lamp that cast long, distorted shadows across the cobblestones, illuminating a weathered wooden sign that hung above a narrow doorway. The words Museum of Whispers were etched into the grain in a jagged, archaic script, the paint peeling away in thin, pale flakes like dead skin. Below the title, a smaller inscription promised the curious a journey into the hidden auditory archives of the deep sea. Silas stopped beneath the sign, watching as the light danced over the letters, creating the illusion that the words themselves were trembling in the wind. The building itself looked less like a human construction and more like a collection of wreckage that had been vomited onto the shore by a particularly vengeful storm. Its timber walls were silvered by salt and warped into unnatural curves, leaning precariously over the sidewalk as if bracing against an invisible tide. Small, circular windows, encrusted with a thick layer of grime and brine, looked like the portholes of a vessel that had spent centuries at the bottom of the trench. There was a profound sense of stillness radiating from the structure, a frozen quality that suggested the museum existed in a pocket of time separate from the rest of the world. It stood as a silent monument to the things the ocean refused to keep, a graveyard of sounds waiting for an audience. A strange, magnetic torpor began to wash over Silas, a lethargy that smoothed out the jagged edges of his anxiety even as his pulse quickened. His fingers, stiff and reddened by the biting coastal chill, fumbled with the buttons of his coat before reaching out toward the dark, heavy wood of the entrance. The desire to escape the suffocating weight of the fog and the relentless, booming heart of the sea became an all-consuming need. He felt a phantom vibration in the soles of his feet, a low-frequency thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the museum. It was a siren's call for the weary, a promise of shelter within the belly of a leviathan made of cedar and shadow. With a sharp intake of the brine-heavy air, Silas placed his palm against the door and pushed, feeling the immense weight of the timber resist him for a fraction of a second. The hinges did not scream, instead, they gave way with a long, agonizingly low groan that sounded like a heavy chest being dragged across a stone floor. As the door swung inward, a draft of air that was somehow colder and drier than the fog outside rushed out to greet him, carrying the scent of dust and old, parched leather. He stepped over the threshold, leaving the rhythm of the crashing waves behind, and as the door clicked shut with a definitive, metallic thud, the silence of the museum swallowed him whole. The transition from the howling exterior to the interior of the Museum of Whispers was so abrupt that it felt like a physical blow to Silas's equilibrium. As the heavy door settled back into its frame, the roar of the Atlantic was severed as if by a guillotine, replaced by a silence so absolute and heavy that it pressed against his eardrums with a crushing weight. This was not the simple absence of noise, but a thick, suffocating layer of auditory vacuum that felt as tangible as a wall of dampened cotton. Every breath Silas took sounded like a gale-force wind in the hollow of his chest, and the soft rustle of his wool coat against his sweater seemed to echo with unnatural clarity. He stood paralyzed for a moment, waiting for his senses to adjust to the sudden lack of stimuli, his eyes darting through the gloom as he tried to find a focal point in the stillness. The air inside the hallway was stagnant, devoid of the salt-laden breeze that had defined his entire journey through Blackwood Bay. It bore a complex, unsettling bouquet that seemed to tell a story of slow, calculated decay, starting with the dry, dusty scent of ancient parchment and brittle bindings. Beneath that layer lay the heavy, cloying aroma of beeswax, as if every surface had been polished to a funeral shine, intended to preserve the wood against a rot that had already taken hold. Most disturbing, however, was a faint, sickly sweet undertone that lingered at the back of his throat, the smell of stagnant water trapped in a ceramic vase for far too long, where stems had turned to gray slime. It was the scent of something that had once been alive and vibrant, now reduced to a fermented, forgotten soup in the dark. The museum's main hall stretched out before him like the gullet of a great beast, narrow and excessively long, with a ceiling so low that it seemed to graze the top of his head. The walls were draped in heavy, light-absorbing velvet of a color so dark it appeared as a void, serving to further deaden any stray vibration that might dare to disturb the sanctuary. A row of dim, amber-hued bulbs hung from the ceiling on frayed cords, their light weak and jaundiced, casting long, wavering shadows that pooled in the corners like spilled ink. Silas watched as a single mote of dust drifted through one of these meager beams, its slow, tumbling descent the only movement in the entire frozen gallery. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to turn and flee, to return to the honest violence of the storm, but his feet remained rooted to the floorboards. Arranged in two precise rows down the center of the hall were massive, high-backed chairs that resembled thrones of a bygone, more somber era. They were upholstered in black leather that had been worn down to a dull, sickly sheen, with thousands of tiny, spiderweb cracks marring the surface like the wrinkles on an ancient face. Each chair was positioned with its back to its neighbor, facing the velvet-draped walls as if the sitters were meant to contemplate nothingness while they listened. The sight of the empty seats, waiting in the half-light, sent a fresh shiver down Silas's spine. They looked like a congregation of eyeless spectators, perpetually waiting for a performance that had started centuries ago. He could almost see the ghosts of previous visitors clinging to the cracked armrests, their forms dissolved by the very silence they had come to experience. Emerging from the base of each chair were thick, serpentine cables encased in a heavy black braiding that caught the dim light with an oily luster. These wires did not lie flat but twisted and coiled across the floorboards in erratic, organic patterns, weaving between the legs of the furniture like a nest of sleeping eels. They seemed to possess a weight and a density that suggested they were more than mere conduits for electricity, perhaps holding within them the very pressure of the deep sea. Silas found himself stepping carefully between these black coils, terrified of what might happen if he were to accidentally crush one beneath his boot. In his peripheral vision, the shadows of the cables appeared to twitch and shift, an optical illusion born of his own escalating paranoia and the flickering jaundiced light. Silas scanned the shadows at the far end of the hall, searching for a ticket booth, a curator, or even a simple sign-in sheet, but the room remained stubbornly devoid of human presence. There was no desk, no bell to ring, and no sound of a distant footfall or a rhythmic breath to indicate that he was not entirely alone in the building. The lack of an overseer made the museum feel less like a public attraction and more like a trap that had been left set and baited, waiting for a specific kind of prey to wander in. He opened his mouth to call out, to ask if anyone was there, but the density of the silence seemed to catch the words in his throat, strangling them before they could reach his lips. The building felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for him to commit to the experience it offered. Driven by a strange, numb compulsion, Silas approached the nearest chair at the end of the row, his movements slow and deliberate as if he were underwater. He reached out a trembling hand to touch the armrest, finding the leather to be unexpectedly cold, with a texture that felt uncomfortably like clammy, dehydrated skin. As he lowered himself into the seat, the frame groaned beneath him, but it was not a dry wood creak. Instead, the internal padding made a wet sound, a rhythmic squelch that suggested the cushions were saturated with moisture. The sound was so vivid and visceral that Silas nearly leaped back out of the chair, his heart hammering against his ribs in a frantic, uneven tattoo. He forced himself to stay, gripping the cold armrests until his knuckles turned white, waiting for the sound to subside into the oppressive quiet. Resting on a small iron hook attached to the side of the chair were the headphones, a massive, archaic-looking apparatus constructed of dark steel and polished copper. They were incredibly heavy when he lifted them, the metal biting into his palms with a chill that seemed to seep directly into his joints. The ear cups were oversized and lined with the same worn, black leather as the chair, smelling faintly of ozone and old, cold sweat. Silas stared at the intricate copper filigree on the exterior of the cups, which depicted stylized waves and distorted, long-limbed sea creatures that seemed to writhe as he turned the device in his hands. He felt a sense of profound hesitation, a primal warning bell ringing in the back of his mind, but the curiosity that had brought him to Blackwood Bay was now a tether, pulling him toward the inevitable. With a slow, trembling motion, Silas lifted the headphones and settled them over his ears, the thick pads sealing against his skull with a soft, airtight hiss. The world he had known, even the distorted version within the museum walls, vanished instantly, replaced by a vacuum so intense it felt as though the air were being sucked out of his head. He could hear the sudden, booming thud of his own pulse, a rhythmic drumming that filled the void with the sound of his internal machinery. For several long seconds, there was nothing else, just the internal cacophony of his body and the high-pitched ring of absolute sensory deprivation. Then, a faint, crystalline vibration began to thrum through the copper components of the headphones, a prelude to the sound he had come to find. The audio began not as a voice or a melody, but as a subtle, granular hiss that reminded Silas of dry sand being poured over a sheet of glass. It was a soft, white noise that seemed to fluctuate in intensity, rising and falling in a way that mimicked the natural ebb and flow of a distant tide. This was the sound of the sea, yet it lacked the violent, crashing quality of the waves outside. It was a deeper, more intimate recording, as if the microphone had been placed at the bottom of a limestone grotto. He closed his eyes, allowing the sound to wash over him, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to dissipate as he surrendered to the hypnotic drone. The hiss was textured and complex, containing within it the echoes of 1,000 tiny bubbles bursting and the slow, grinding friction of ancient stones shifting on the ocean floor. As the recording continued, the sound of the shifting sand began to deepen, transforming into a low-frequency hum that vibrated in the very center of Silas's skull. It was a soothing, melodic resonance that seemed to synchronize with his breathing, lulling him into a state of heavy, dreamlike lethargy. He could almost see the dark, sunless water of the grotto, the way it would swirl in slow, languid circles around the barnacle-encrusted rocks. There was a rhythmic quality to the audio that was deeply deceptive, a siren song of tranquility that whispered of rest and forgotten depths. Silas felt his grip on the armrests loosen, his head tilting back against the chair as he allowed the monochromatic sound of the deep to fill his mind, unaware that the white noise was beginning to subtly shift into something more structured, more deliberate, and infinitely more personal. The hypnotic, rhythmic drone of the deep-sea recording began to undergo a subtle, microscopic transformation, shifting from the amorphous wash of white noise into something more structured and sinister. Beneath the layer of rushing water and granular hiss, a new texture emerged, a sound that was sharply distinct from the fluid environment of the grotto. It was a series of rhythmic, brittle clicks, reminiscent of the sound produced by snapping dry, thin twigs between one's fingers, or perhaps the way a sheet of ice fissures when a heavy weight is placed upon it. Every few seconds, a sharper, more resonant crunch would cut through the audio, a sound that Silas could only describe as the splintering of small, delicate bones beneath a vast, watery pressure. These noises were not random, they seemed to possess a predatory intent, stalking through the background of the recording with a calculated, rhythmic precision that made the hair on the back of Silas's neck stand in rigid, cold defiance. Silas sat perfectly still, his muscles locking into a state of involuntary paralysis as the auditory landscape continued to warp and distort. The sounds of breaking bone became wetter, more saturated, as if the fractures were occurring within a thick, viscous medium rather than open air. He could hear the friction of jagged edges rubbing against each other, a sound that felt like a needle scratching against the interior of his own skull. The amber light of the museum seemed to dim further, the jaundiced glow pulsing in an erratic, dying rhythm that matched the fractures in the audio. He felt a bead of cold sweat detach itself from his temple and begin a slow, agonizing crawl down the side of his face, its passage feeling like the touch of a freezing, phantom finger. Then, the background noise plummeted into a sudden, vacuum-like silence, leaving only a faint, high-pitched ring that made Silas's vision swim in the darkness. Out of this hollow void, a voice emerged, so thin and fragile that it seemed to be held together by nothing more than a desperate thread of static. It was a feminine voice, but one that had been hollowed out, stripped of its warmth and replaced with the echoing timbre of a deep, limestone well. The voice did not speak to the world at large, it spoke directly into the center of his consciousness, pronouncing his name with a clarity that was impossible for a decades-old recording. "Silas," it whispered, the final consonant dragging out into a long, liquid hiss that sounded like air escaping a submerged chamber. The shock of hearing his own name was so violent that Silas's body reacted before his mind could process the impossibility of the event. He twisted in the leather chair, his neck snapping around to look toward the dark, velvet-shrouded hallway behind him, half expecting to see a figure standing in the jaundiced pool of light. His eyes searched the shadows, darting from the empty, high-backed thrones to the twisting, eel-like cables on the floorboards, but the museum remained a tomb of absolute stillness. The jaundiced light caught the dust motes as they tumbled through the stagnant air, but there was no curator, no visitor, and no mother standing in the gloom. The contrast between the intimate, whispered command in his ears and the vacant, decaying room before him created a schism in his reality that made the floor beneath his boots feel as though it were turning to liquid. As he turned his head back, his eyes fixated on the copper filigree of the headphones resting against his reflection in a nearby glass case, the voice in the recording began to transition from a call to a melody. It was a tune that had been buried under 20 years of grief and repressed memory, a haunting, minor-key nursery rhyme that his mother had used to ward off the terrors of the coastal storms. 5 little ravens on silver gates, watching for the tide that never waits, the voice crooned, each syllable delivered with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. The melody was identical to the one he had heard in the nursery of his childhood home, but the tone was now infused with a cold, saline rot, as if the song had been preserved in a jar of brine for 2 decades. The auditory experience became even more visceral as the quality of the voice shifted, taking on a horrifyingly physical dimension that Silas could feel in his own throat. Every word was now accompanied by a soft, wet smacking sound, the unmistakable noise of a tongue peeling away from the roof of a mouth that was perpetually flooded with water. He could hear the moist click of vocal cords struggling to vibrate through a layer of silt, and the heavy, labored intake of breath that sounded more like the gurgling of a tide pool than human respiration. It was as if the person singing was standing inches from the microphone, their face submerged in a shallow basin of seawater, forcing the lyrics out through a mouthful of black sand and brine. Paranoia, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, began to tighten its grip around Silas's windpipe, making every breath a shallow, desperate struggle. He felt the sound beginning to bypass his ears entirely, the vibrations of the nursery rhyme resonating within the very marrow of his jaw and the roots of his teeth. The silver gates mentioned in the song seemed to manifest as a metallic taste in his mouth, a sharp, copper tang that made his saliva feel thick and unswallowable. He was no longer just a listener, his skeletal structure was becoming a part of the broadcast, his bones acting as a tuning fork for the wet, rhythmic snapping that continued to punctuate the melody. The boundaries between his internal self and the external recording were beginning to erode, leaving him exposed to the encroaching darkness of the deep. The lyrics of the rhyme began to deviate from the version he remembered, the words twisting into new, unrecognizable shapes that spoke of depth and pressure. 1 for the heart that is heavy and cold, 2 for the secrets that never grow old, the voice chanted, the wet, smacking sounds becoming more pronounced and frenetic. Silas closed his eyes, but the darkness behind his lids was instantly filled with the image of 5 blackbirds perched on a gate of tarnished silver, their feathers slick with oil and their eyes replaced by milky, unseeing pearls. He could feel the pressure in his ears increasing, a physical weight that mimicked the sensation of diving too deep into the cold Atlantic, until the pain in his temples became a dull, throbbing ache. He tried to reach up and remove the headphones, but his hands felt as though they were weighted with lead, his fingers twitching uselessly against the cold, cracked leather of the armrests. The cables on the floor, those black, braided coils he had compared to eels, seemed to pulse in his peripheral vision, their shadows elongating and retracting in time with the singer's ragged, watery breaths. He felt a sudden, freezing draft of air move past his ankles, despite the museum being a sealed, stagnant environment, and he could smell the unmistakable scent of the deep sea, not the fresh salt of the surface, but the ancient, suffocating smell of mud and decay from the abyssal plains. The nursery rhyme reached its 3rd verse, and the voice began to layer upon itself, creating a discordant, polyphonic chorus that filled every corner of his mind. 3 for the breath that is bubbles and foam, 4 for the wanderer far from his home, the voices sang in a terrifying, wet harmony. The sound of the breaking bones returned, now much louder, as if a large skeleton were being systematically dismantled right next to his ear. Silas felt his own heart rate begin to sync with the crunching noises, his chest heaving in a desperate attempt to maintain its own rhythm against the overwhelming cadence of the museum. The jaundiced light in the hall flickered and died for a full second, leaving him in a total, terrifying blackness where the only reality was the sound of his mother's voice rotting in his ears. A single, freezing tear finally broke free from his eye and trailed down his cheek, but as it reached the corner of his mouth, it didn't taste like salt, it tasted like the bitter, metallic silt he had smelled upon entering the town. The voice in the headphones grew louder, more intimate, the wet smacking sounds now so close that he could almost feel the phantom spray of water against his skin. 5 for the silence that swallows the scream, 5 for the man who is lost in the dream, the chorus whispered, the words dissolving into a cacophony of bubbling and splashing. Silas felt his teeth begin to chatter, not from the cold, but from the sheer, violent frequency of the audio as it reached a crescendo of distorted, watery shrieks. The room seemed to tilt on its axis, the perspective of the narrow hall stretching out into an infinite, dark tunnel that led directly into the heart of the bay. He could no longer distinguish the sound of his own pulse from the heavy thud of the waves or the rhythmic crunching of the recording. Everything was becoming one single, unified vibration, a dark symphony that demanded his total, unblinking attention. The nursery rhyme had finished, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying, for it was a silence that felt pregnant with the arrival of something vast and ancient. Silas sat in the darkness, his hands frozen to the chair, his mind a fractured mirror reflecting the image of 5 ravens waiting on a silver gate, while the museum around him began to hum with a low, predatory energy that whispered of an end to all light. The violent motion of Silas Vance's hands was an instinctive rebellion of the flesh, a desperate, frantic tearing at the heavy copper and leather that had become a conduit for the impossible. As he wrenched the headphones from his skull, the metal edges bit into the soft skin of his ears, leaving a stinging, burning trail of heat that contrasted sharply with the icy terror radiating from his core. The apparatus fell with a dull, heavy thud against the side of the chair, swinging on its thick, braided cable like a pendulum of black shadow, its copper filigree catching the dying amber light in a final, mocking glint. Silas's breath came in ragged, jagged bursts that seemed to echo through the vaulted silence of the hall, each exhale a mist of white vapor that vanished into the stagnant, beeswax-scented air. His legs, trembling with a sudden, debilitating weakness, pushed him upward from the saturated leather, causing the chair to groan and tilt dangerously on the uneven floorboards. A persistent, high-frequency ringing remained lodged in the center of his brain, a phantom echo of the nursery rhyme that refused to be silenced by the simple act of removal. His heart was no longer a rhythmic muscle but a panicked, feathered thing, battering itself against the cage of his ribs with a violence that made his entire chest cavity ache with every frantic pulse. He stood for a frozen eternity, staring at the empty, high-backed thrones that lined the narrow gallery, his eyes searching for any sign of a hidden speaker or a mechanical trick. The silence of the museum had returned, but it was now a predatory, expectant quiet that seemed to lean in toward him, whispering of the things that dwelt in the lightless trenches of the Atlantic. Every shadow in the corner of the room appeared to lengthen, stretching like dark, viscous fingers toward the hem of his coat, while the yellowed bulbs overhead flickered with a rhythmic, dying hum. With a muffled groan that was more of a whimpering intake of air, Silas turned and stumbled toward the entrance, his boots slipping on the salt-slicked wood of the floor. Each step felt like a labor against a heavy, invisible tide, the very air of the museum thickening until it possessed the consistency of cold syrup. He fumbled with the heavy, iron-bound latch of the door, his fingers numb and clumsy as if they had been submerged in freezing water for hours. When the door finally swung open, the groan of its hinges sounded like a human scream muffled by a great depth of silt and sand. He threw himself out into the evening, his lungs burning with the sudden influx of the cold, brine-heavy air of Blackwood Bay, expecting the relief of the open sky to wash away the lingering rot of the recording. But the street offered no sanctuary, only a deepening of the monochromatic nightmare that had begun within the timber walls. The twilight of the 13th of November had surrendered to a gray, oppressive dusk, and the fog had matured into a dense, swirling shroud that erased the boundaries of the world. It was a thick, tactile mist that clung to the rough stone of the buildings and the rusted iron of the railings, turning the town into a collection of vague, dissolving shapes. Silas stood on the threshold, his hands gripping the cold stone of the doorway as he watched the fog move in slow, undulating waves across the cobblestones, resembling the motion of giant, pale kelp forests in an underwater current. The smell of the sea had intensified, carrying with it the sharp, metallic tang of wet rust and the cloying, sweet stench of kelp that had been left to bake under a sunless sky. He began to walk, his movements jerky and uncoordinated as he tried to put as much distance as possible between himself and the Museum of Whispers. The sound of his own footfalls was a rhythmic, wet slapping against the pavement, a lonely cadence that felt dangerously loud in the muffled stillness of the town. He forced his mind to engage in a frantic, desperate rationalization, reciting the principles of subsonic frequencies and auditory hallucinations to the pounding beat of his heart. He tried to convince himself that the museum was a sophisticated sensory trap, a parlor trick designed to exploit the natural paranoia of the isolated coastal environment through hidden speakers and targeted sound waves. His mind conjured images of hidden microphones and frequency modulators, grasping at the cold, hard logic of technology to stave off the encroaching realization that the voice he had heard was not a recording at all. The dampness of the evening seeped through his heavy wool coat, settling into his skin like a layer of fine, freezing needles. Every shuttered window he passed seemed to watch him with a flat, wooden indifference, the peeling paint looking like scales on the flank of a great, dying fish. He could taste the silt in the air, a gritty, bitter residue that coated his tongue and made every swallow feel like he was consuming the very essence of the bay's muddy floor. The ringing in his ears had not subsided, instead, it had transformed into a low, thrumming vibration that he could feel in the soles of his feet, a frequency that seemed to be emitted by the very earth beneath the cobblestones. He felt small and exposed, a solitary spark of warmth in a world that was rapidly turning to cold, gray stone and lightless water. As he reached the midpoint of the long, curving street that led back toward the harbor, a figure began to coalesce out of the shifting wall of fog. It was a young woman, her silhouette sharp and dark against the pale gray of the mist, walking with a slow, deliberate gait that suggested a profound lack of urgency. She wore a long, heavy coat of a dark, indeterminate color, the fabric sodden with moisture until it hung from her frame like a heavy, sodden skin. Silas slowed his pace, his breath hitching in his throat as he watched her approach, her head bowed slightly as if she were contemplating the wet stones at her feet. There was something unnatural about the way she moved, a rhythmic, swaying motion that mirrored the rise and fall of the tide he had heard in the headphones. The distance between them closed with an agonizing slowness, the fog swirling around their legs like a living thing, binding them together in a shared, claustrophobic space. Silas felt a cold sweat break out across his brow, the moisture mixing with the fine mist of the evening until his entire face felt slick and clammy. He moved to the very edge of the sidewalk, intending to give the woman as much room as possible, his eyes fixed on her face as she drew nearer. Her skin was the color of a blanched almond, pale and translucent, with a network of fine blue veins visible at her temples like the tributaries of a cold, underground river. Her lips were pressed together into a thin, straight line, an expression of absolute, mask-like stillness that betrayed no emotion, no recognition, and no life. When she finally came abreast of him, Silas froze, his muscles locking in a state of primal, lizard-brain terror that made his vision swim. He expected to hear the rustle of her coat or the sound of her breathing in the quiet air, but the only sound that accompanied her was a low, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate from the very center of her torso. It was a sound that did not travel through the air but through the density of his own bones, a resonance that made his teeth ache and his chest thrum with a sympathetic frequency. From deep within the cavity of her chest, behind the layers of wool and flesh, he heard the unmistakable, wet whisper of the nursery rhyme. 5 little ravens on silver gates, the vibration murmured, the words delivered with the same liquid, rhythmic precision as the voice in the museum. The sound was not coming from her mouth, her lips remained sealed in that horrifying, static line, and her jaw did not move by even a fraction of a millimeter. The voice was a visceral, internal broadcast, a sound produced by the vibration of her lungs and the hollow chambers of her ribs, turning her entire body into a fleshy, living speaker. Silas could hear the wet, smacking click of the consonants and the labored, gurgling intake of breath between the lines, sounding as though her internal organs were submerged in a layer of black, brackish water. The melody was identical to the one his mother had sung, a haunting, minor key loop that seemed to be playing on an endless, internal reel. The woman did not look at him, she did not even blink, her eyes fixed on some invisible point in the fog as she drifted past him like a piece of flotsam. A wave of nausea crashed over Silas as he realized that the vibration from the woman's chest was synchronizing with the thrumming he felt in his own feet. As she moved away, the internal whisper mixed with the slow, rhythmic crunch of her boots on the wet stone, creating a discordant, layering effect that made his head spin. He turned his head to watch her retreating form, but the fog was already beginning to swallow her back into its gray embrace, leaving only the fading, subterranean hum of the rime behind. The sound didn't dissipate in the air, it seemed to sink into the ground, vibrating through the cobblestones until it was nothing more than a ghost of a sensation in his heels. Silas stood alone in the center of the sidewalk, his hands shaking so violently that he had to bury them in his pockets to keep from crying out. The realization began to dawn on him with the slow, crushing weight of an advancing glacier. The museum had not been a sanctuary of recordings, but a temple of transmission. The town of Blackwood Bay was not merely a collection of buildings and people, but a unified, vibrating entity, a choir of silent mouths and screaming chests. He looked down at his own hands, wondering if he could feel the same low-frequency hum beginning to take root in his own marrow, if his own ribcage was even now preparing to host the same watery melody. The fog around him seemed to thicken even further, becoming a solid, suffocating wall that pressed against his eyes and mouth, tasting of salt, silt, and the ancient, rhythmic secrets of the deep. He was no longer a visitor in a strange town, he was a silent note in a symphony that was just beginning to find its voice. Silas Vance propelled himself through the suffocating gray veil of the fog, his lungs screaming with the effort of breathing air that felt more like liquid than gas. Each footfall on the uneven cobblestone sent a jarring vibration up his shins, a rhythmic, wet slap that seemed to be immediately swallowed by the predatory silence of the buildings. He was heading for the harbor, driven by a primal, irrational hope that the open expanse of the Atlantic might offer a clarity that the narrow, winding streets of Blackwood Bay had stolen. The fog was so thick now that he could no longer see the tops of the lamp posts, and the scent of the town had shifted from a mere oceanic brine to a thick, cloying stench of abyssal silt and the sulphurous rot of things that had been buried beneath the seabed for centuries. As he neared the first row of dilapidated warehouses, the silhouette of an elderly man emerged from the mist, standing motionless beside a long, wooden table slick with the refuse of the sea. The man was clad in a tattered yellow slicker that possessed the dull, oily sheen of a dead eel, and his hands moved with a mechanical, repetitive precision as he drew a rusted knife through the belly of a large, silver fish. His face was a landscape of deep, salt-etched fissures, and his eyes remained fixed on the glistening organs he was spilling onto the wood, never once blinking. His mouth was clamped shut, a thin, bloodless line of weathered flesh, yet from the hollow of his cavernous chest erupted a sound like the grinding of tectonic plates far beneath the ocean floor. The sound was a subterranean vibration, a low-frequency hum that carried the unmistakable, haunting cadence of the nursery rhyme about the 5 ravens and the silver gates. It was not a voice carried on the wind, but a physical resonance that shook the table and caused the severed fish heads to dance in the flickering, jaundiced light of a nearby lantern. Silas could hear the wet, grinding friction of mineral against mineral, a rasping sound that seemed to emanate from the old man's very entrails. The fisherman did not look up, his jaw remaining locked in a grim, silent set, while the space around him thrummed with a weight that made the air feel as dense as lead, a sound that spoke of 1,000 fathoms of pressure. Moving further toward the edge of the pier, Silas passed a small boy huddled on a stack of rotting cedar crates, his fingers tracing the spirals of bleached, empty whelk shells with a listless, hypnotic repetition. The child's skin was a sickly, translucent gray, and his hair hung in damp, matted clumps across a forehead that was beaded with a cold, oily sweat that didn't seem to evaporate in the chill. He did not play with the joyful abandon of a child, his eyes were wide and vacant, staring into the swirling fog as if he were watching the movement of some invisible, colossal predator. Though his lips were motionless and his throat showed no sign of muscular effort, a high-pitched, crystalline whisper vibrated out from his small chest, sounding like the tinkling of broken glass falling into a deep, lightless well. This high-frequency whisper was a shrill, distorted echo of the mother's voice Silas had heard in the museum, repeating the line about the silver gates with a terrifying, rhythmic intensity that made his eardrums throb. The sound possessed a physical mass, a vibrational density that felt like freezing, carbonated water being poured directly into Silas's ear canals. The boy's tiny frame seemed to shiver with the force of the internal transmission, his ribs acting as a sounding board for the ancient, watery melody that defied the laws of biology. Silas tried to accelerate his pace, his boots skidding on the salt-slicked wood of the pier, but the vacant, unblinking stare of the child seemed to follow him through the mist, the vibration drilling into the base of his skull. He glanced upward at the row of leaning, salt-encrusted houses that overlooked the harbor like a line of mourning sentinels, and his heart gave a violent, sickening lurch against his ribs. Behind every grime-streaked windowpane, a face was pressed against the glass, men, women, and the elderly, all standing in a state of absolute, catatonic rigidity. Their mouths were all sealed tight, their expressions as flat and lifeless as the wooden planks beneath Silas's feet, yet the very glass of the windows was vibrating visibly in their frames. The collective resonance of dozens of human chests humming the same nursery rhyme created a physical wall of sound that made the air itself ripple and distort, turning the street into a vibrating corridor of madness. The smell of the harbor had now become a tangible presence, a thick, cloying taste of copper and wet silt that coated the back of Silas's throat and made every gasp for air a struggle against the sensation of drowning. The sound was no longer composed of distinct, individual voices, it had merged into a singular, colossal entity, a multi-layered orchestra of the damned that thrummed through the soles of his boots and the marrow of his bones. He felt the vibration climbing up his legs, settling into his pelvis and his spine, a cold, rhythmic invasion that claimed his entire nervous system as a part of its vast, resonant network. Every object in his field of vision, the rusted anchors, the coiled ropes, the rotting pilings, seemed to be shivering in sympathy with the Black Symphony. Amidst the rising tide of the nursery rhyme, a new and more terrifying element emerged, a staccato repetition of his own name, Silas, woven into the liquid spaces between the musical notes. Thousands of silent, unmoving throats were vibrating with the syllables of his identity, the sound resembling the clatter of a million dry, bleached shells being swept across a stony beach by an incoming tide. The name was pronounced with a wet, sibilant hiss that made his skin crawl, a sound that carried the texture of gritty sand and the crushing weight of the abyssal plains. It was as if the town itself was reciting his history, stripping away his privacy and replacing his internal monologue with a public, vibrating record of his presence in the bay. Silas clutched his head in his hands, his fingers digging into his scalp with enough force to draw thin lines of blood, but the sound was no longer an external intrusion he could shut out or escape. The resonance had successfully bypassed his auditory canals and was now being generated by his own internal architecture, his skull acting as a hollow, resonant chamber for the Black Symphony. He could feel the words, 5 little ravens, pulsing in the fluid of his eyes and the very roots of his teeth, a frequency so powerful that it made his vision vibrate in time with the song. His own thoughts, the inner voice he had used to navigate the world for 30 years, were being systematically dismantled and replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thrumming of the deep-sea cadence. His consciousness began to fracture, the coherent narrative of his fear breaking apart into a series of rhythmic, repeating images that mirrored the structure of the song he could not stop hearing. He saw the silver gates rising from the black mud of the harbor floor, their bars encrusted with barnacles that clicked and snapped in the lightless dark. He saw the 5 ravens, their feathers made of wet, oily smoke and their eyes replaced by milky, unseeing pearls, circling a sky that was nothing more than a ceiling of black, crushing water. Every attempt he made to think of a way out, to plan a path to the bus station or the outskirts of town, was intercepted by the rhythm, his mind forced to reset and begin the counting again, 1 for the heart, 2 for the secrets, 3 for the breath. He reached the very edge of the harbor wall, where the stone gave way to a vertical drop into the lightless Atlantic, and here the fog was so thick it felt like a physical barrier, a wall of cold, gray gelatin. Below him, the water was a flat, unmoving expanse of ink, devoid of waves, foam, or any sign of tidal movement, looking more like a solid sheet of polished obsidian than liquid. The sound at the water's edge was at its absolute peak, a deafening, subsonic roar that made his entire skeletal structure vibrate with a painful, bone-deep ache that radiated from his joints. He could feel the moisture in his own lungs beginning to hum, the very air inside his body vibrating in perfect, terrifying sympathy with the thousands of silent singers standing in the shadows behind him. A single, rhythmic twitch began in Silas's right hand, a spasmodic contraction of the muscles that matched the cadence of the grinding stones he had heard from the fishermen. He watched in a state of detached, clinical horror as his fingers began to tap against his thigh in perfect synchronization with the nursery rhyme, a movement he could no longer control or even slow down. The transition was almost complete, the boundary between his individual consciousness and the collective, vibrating whisper of Blackwood Bay had become a thin, permeable membrane, dissolving in the acid of the sound. He stood on the precipice of the dark water, his mouth closed tight in a final, useless act of defiance, while his own chest began to emit a low, wet, and rhythmic hum that spoke of the silver gates and the 5 ravens waiting for him in the deep. The wooden skeleton of the old harbor pier groaned under Silas Vance's weight, a sound that was less of a structural complaint and more of a dying gasp. The ancient cedar planks were no longer solid matter but a porous, weeping mesh of salt-saturated decay, crumbling into gray, ash-like splinters beneath the frantic soles of his boots. With every step, he could feel the wood yielding, the fibers surrendering to the relentless humidity and the weight of a man who was rapidly becoming a hollow vessel for something far heavier than flesh and bone. The air here was so saturated with the scent of stagnant brine and ancient, lightless silt that it felt like inhaling a handful of cold, wet earth, coating his lungs in a layer of mineral residue that made every gasping breath a labor of pure agony. His fingers, numb and white at the tips, clutched at the air as if trying to grasp the disappearing fragments of the world he had once known, but there was only the fog, a thick, tactile shroud that tasted of copper and forgotten graves. Before him, the Atlantic Ocean stretched out toward a horizon that had long since ceased to exist, its surface a flat, unmoving expanse of ink that looked more like polished obsidian than liquid. There were no waves here, no white crests of foam, no rhythmic surge of the tide against the rotting pilings. The water was a vast, oil-slicked mirror that refused to reflect the jaundiced light of the town or the bruised gray of the leaden sky. It possessed a terrifying, unnatural stillness, a density that suggested it was not composed of water at all, but of the condensed shadows of the prehistoric trenches. The silence of the sea was a physical pressure, an absolute vacuum that seemed to pull at the very air in Silas's chest, demanding the tribute of his last remaining breath. He stood at the crumbling precipice, the very edge of the known world, while behind him the town of Blackwood Bay held its collective, vibrating breath. Silas felt the urge to scream, a primal, desperate need to shatter the monochromatic nightmare with the force of his own identity, to assert his existence against the encroaching darkness. He opened his mouth wide, his jaw aching as he forced it to the limit of its hinges, his chest heaving with the accumulated terror of the afternoon. He summoned every ounce of his remaining strength, his vocal cords tightening and his diaphragm contracting to produce a sound that should have been heard across the entire bay, a clarion call for help or at least a final declaration of defiance. But no scream emerged from his throat, there was no roar of human vocalization, no vibration of air over living tissue, only a profound, hollow emptiness that felt like a cold wind blowing through an abandoned cathedral. Instead of a cry, a dry, rhythmic whisper began to spill out from between his teeth, a sibilant hiss that carried the precise, terrifying cadence of the nursery rhyme he had heard in the museum. The sound was not a product of his will, it was a rhythmic extrusion of the frequency that had now completely colonized his nervous system. Each word was a puff of cold, gray vapor, a sequence of syllables about the 5 little ravens and the silver gates that vibrated through his jawbone and the very roots of his molars. He could feel his vocal cords being reshaped by the sound, his cartilage hardening and shifting to accommodate the new, non-human melody that was being broadcast through his anatomy. He was no longer a man attempting to speak, he was a biological instrument, a mouthpiece for a symphony that had been playing since the first drop of salt water fell onto the cooling earth. The realization of his own erasure hit him with the force of a slow-motion collision, a cold, clinical understanding that his personality, his memories, and his very name were being systematically overwritten. The internal voice that had once guided him, the private sanctuary of his own thoughts, was being drowned out by the rising tide of the collective whisper that now resonated from the buildings and the people behind him. He could feel the townspeople standing in the fog, a silent army of vibrating chests and closed mouths, their individual identities already dissolved into the same singular, rhythmic purpose. They were the choir, the sea was the conductor, and the town itself was the cathedral, all of them vibrating in a terrifying, unified frequency that rendered the concept of a solitary human life utterly meaningless. Silas looked down into the black, mirror-like water that lapped almost imperceptibly against the base of the pier, and his vision began to pulse in time with the thrumming in his bones. As the fog shifted slightly, he saw that the water was not empty. Beneath the oily, obsidian surface, thousands of faces were suspended in the dark, blanched and translucent like the skin of deep-sea fish. They were arranged in endless, orderly rows, their eyes wide and milky with cataracts of salt, staring upward with a fixed, expectant intensity. Every single mouth was sewn shut with thick, black threads of wet kelp, the stitches pulling the skin into a state of permanent, agonizing silence that was the foundation of the sound. Despite their sealed lips, their bodies were shivering with a high-frequency vibration that sent ripples of static through the dark water, a silent, subterranean hum that matched the nursery rhyme exactly. Among those thousands of blanched, unmoving countenances, Silas began to recognize the subtle contours of his own features, as if his reflection had already detached itself from his body and taken its place in the watery congregation. He saw the same blue veins at the temples, the same curve of the jaw, all of it becoming a part of the vast, vibrating tapestry of the harbor floor. The faces did not look like individuals, they looked like notes on a page of music, each one a necessary component of the great, abyssal symphony that was now reaching its final, crushing crescendo. The collective resonance of the drowned thousands rose up through the water and the stone of the pier, a subsonic roar that made Silas's vision blur and his equilibrium vanish into the salt-heavy air. The resistance in his muscles, the last, stubborn spark of his instinct to survive, finally flickered and died like a candle in a lightless cave. The fear that had propelled him through the streets of Blackwood Bay was replaced by a heavy, narcotic sense of inevitability, a feeling that he was merely returning to a home he had forgotten he belonged to. His heart rate slowed, no longer hammering against his ribs but instead expanding and contracting in a long, slow rhythm that matched the deep-sea currents. The cold of the evening no longer bit into his skin, he felt a strange, chilling warmth, as if his blood was being replaced by the bitter, metallic silt of the bay. He was a piece of driftwood, a fragment of wreckage, a final, lingering syllable in a song that was now ready to be finished. Without a tremor of hesitation, Silas took a final step forward, his boot leaving the crumbling edge of the pier and finding only the empty, fog-laden air. For a fleeting second, he hung suspended between the gray world of the town and the black world of the water, a transitional state where the silence of his life met the scream of his destiny. There was no sound of his falling, no rush of wind, only the sensation of gravity pulling him toward the perfect, obsidian mirror that waited below. In that final moment of descent, the silence he had sought was finally revealed to be a lie. The silence was actually a sound so immense and so profound that it could only be heard by those who had ceased to be human. The water did not splash when he struck it, it opened with a soft, hungry hiss, the oily surface parting like a heavy velvet curtain to welcome him into its depths. The cold was absolute, a crushing, crystalline embrace that instantly paralyzed his limbs and drove the last remaining bubble of air from his lungs. As the liquid filled his mouth and throat, it didn't feel like drowning, it felt like being filled with the very essence of the ocean's memory, a dark, vibrating wisdom that replaced the need for oxygen. He felt the weight of the pressure as he sank, the light of the surface fading into a tiny, jaundiced pinprick before being extinguished entirely by the density of the black Atlantic. Beneath the surface, the sound was no longer a whisper, it was a deafening, majestic roar that vibrated through every atom of his being, a final, glorious cry of the abyss that celebrated his arrival. Silas felt the phantom threads of kelp beginning to weave through his own lips, the stitches tightening with a soft, wet click as his mouth was sealed in the eternal, sacred silence of the choir. He took his place among the thousands of blanched faces, his body beginning to shiver with the same rhythmic, subterranean frequency that held the world in its grip. He was no longer Silas Vance, he was the Five Ravens, he was the Silver Gates, he was the heartbeat of the deep sea. On the 13th of November, the fog in Blackwood Bay finally began to lift, revealing a town that was as still and silent as a graveyard of stone. The Museum of Whispers stood dark and empty, its jaundiced bulbs finally burnt out, its leather chairs saturated with the residue of 1,000 visitors. There was no one on the streets, no fisherman at the pier, no boy playing with the shells, and no young woman in a long coat. The only sound that remained was a faint, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to come from the very ground itself, a low-frequency whisper that echoed the cadence of a nursery rhyme long forgotten by the world above. The symphony had concluded, the transmission was complete, and the only voice that remained to tell the story was the one that now belonged entirely to the sea.